Margin. Cross the margin. Podcast.
Welcome to Across the Margin, the podcast. My name is Michael Shields, and today I am thrilled to share with you a conversation I had with an extremely talented writer, one I've been a fan of and reading for some time, Jesse Jarnow. Jesse writes for many publications, from Rolling Stone to Pitchfork to Wired to Relix and beyond. And the books he has released are all deeply insightful and excellent reads. He put out Big Day Coming, Yola Tango and the Rise of Indie Rock in 2012. And in 2016, he released the excellent Heads, a biography of psychedelic America. His latest book is entitled Wasn't That a Time? The Weavers, the Blacklist, and the Battle for the Soul of America. And this outstanding book is the focus of today's episode. Wasn't That a Time isn't simply a comprehensive telling of the untold story of the Weavers, the profoundly influential folk pop quartet who rose to fame in the 50s, but it also serves as a deep dive into the history of folk music in America and into the uncertain time period of American history that was the 1950s and 60s, a time period that we can draw many parallels to today's divisive America. In this episode, Jesse and I talk about what made the Weavers so special. We discuss the amount of research he did to bring this wonderful book to life. We talk about protest music in general and the power of music and art to not only fight oppression, but to bring people together. I have no doubt you will enjoy this interview. And do yourself a favor and grab this book. It's so good. So before we dive in, just a reminder that Across the Margin, the podcast, is part of the Osiris Podcast Network. Osiris is a family of podcasts that connects you with podcasts, videos, and live experiences about artists and topics you love. Check out osirispod.com and get in the loop. And while you're there, at osirispod.com, sign up for the newsletter. They'll send you updates about new podcasts, new events, and everything they got going on over there. And Jesse Jarnow, who I do speak with in this episode, he does have a podcast on Osiris. It is called Alternate Roots, and at the end of our discussion, we talk about that some as well. So stay tuned for that, and let's dig in. Here is my conversation with Jesse Jarnow. Awesome. Thank you, Jesse, for having me here to your home, especially, and huge fan of your work, your previous books, and your work at Rolling Stone, everything you do. It's really, I'm always reading your stuff, but this book we're here to talk about today, Wasn't That a Time? It floored me. So bravo, congrats, and thanks for having me in once again.
My pleasure, and thank you so much. I'm really glad you dug it.
Yeah, it's so cool. So I just want to start and just to ask simply, why the Weavers? What led you to do this deep dive?
Well, they were my favorite band when I was a kid. They were what got played in my house. Yeah. That was my mom was a folkie, and my dad was a folkie.
Okay.
My dad, was at all the big Newport folk festivals in the early '60s. Saw Dylan go electric.
Yep. Oh wow, he was there.
Oh yeah. And my mom. I'm pretty sure I actually saw the Weavers. Definitely saw a lot of those folky acts, and her parents especially were old school progressives. Like were involved in the Henry Wallace campaign in 1948 and the Adlai Stevenson campaign. Yeah. Really like lefties.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the Weavers were like the traditional music of my household in some way, in that it was like I was being raised in this progressive tradition or something like that. But that wasn't like beat over my head in any sense. It wasn't like this is the political music that, is going to inform your worldview. It was more just like I fell in love with their harmonies and their singing.
The sound and kind of the soundtrack of your youth.
And Pete Seeger solo records too. But the Weavers were my first favorite band. They were the first band where I can name all four members of the band. And just knew a little, I didn't know their detailed history like I do now, but I knew some of it. And that was just exciting for me to have that new thing, like, oh, there's this thing called bands, you know?
Yeah.
So after I wrote my last book, I was just, it came out in the spring of 2016.
Was the Rise of Indie Rock?
Or Heads.
Heads was after that. Okay,
yeah, Heads
sorry
came
about
out in
that.
2016.
Yep.
And I was just, getting back into freelancing and thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I did start thinking about other book topics and just running in my head through music that I loved that there was no full-length book about. The Weavers came up and it occurred to me. And I, revisited them a little bit. And casually mentioned it to my editor, who didn't actually seem that interested in it at the time. And I was like, oh, okay. And I sort of, got on with my life. And then the 2016 election happened. And all of a sudden, like literally within weeks, blacklists are back in the news. And, people getting slurred for being globalists or just this whole, this polarization happened that probably like a lot of people, I knew the country was pretty deeply polarized, but I didn't realize exactly how deeply polarized.
Yep. Same here.
And suddenly the Weavers just seemed like, oh, yeah, that's way more topical now. And I revisited it with my editor, and he's like, oh, yeah, let's do that.
That's exactly where I was going. I was kind of curious, because there are profound parallels to what is happening in America now, and I didn't know if it influenced your angle or influenced your perspectives or just kind of fueled your fire, and you just answered it right there, which is really, really cool. And it's just, it's wild. You get to see with how much has changed, how much has stayed the same, too, which is pretty daunting.
And for me, again, that was definitely my thought when I started was, oh, wow, there are all these parallels. But then sort of going into it and getting deep into it, it's like, that there are things that are, you see kind of these mirrors. But to me, it's almost more of a continuity in some way, because you see, like, the beginnings of these conversations that are still happening now about, music and cultural appropriation and, blacklists and politics. But you also see, like, literally some of the same characters, like Roy Cohn, who is, an influence, obviously the mentor to He Who Shall Not Be Named.
Yep.
And
Angels in America. I saw that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he's bounced around that. Yep.
And all of these institutions and things like that, America First was this big idea that the conservatives were really, throwing around at that point. And all of these ideas that, it's not necessarily parallels, they just sort of continued. Maybe some ideas were, not so ascendant over the last half century. Now or more than half century, now they are again, which is terrifying. But there's a through line, and I think that I wanted to pull that out as well. That it wasn't just like, oh, here's this thing that happened many, many years ago, and look at all the similarities. It's like, no, this is the same thing.
Yeah.
These are the same.
People have been fighting the good fight for some time now.
Yeah, the same forces, the same organizations, the same causes. It's just the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's just an earlier part of the narrative of this sort of arc that's gone up and down over since, I mean, you can trace it back way further than that. Sure. You could probably trace it to, anti-slavery versus slavery in the war, or in the Civil War, or, even further back. But it's sort of kind of tracing American progressive radicalism.
Yeah, absolutely. So communism and the government's crackdown on it lies at the center of this book, and the Blacklist is mentioned even in just the subtitle. I believe there's some confusion now what communism meant to someone like Pete Seeger, and I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit.
I mean, so American communism was extremely different from Russian communism, and
I think that gets lost a little bit.
That does get lost, and part of the reason that gets lost, and for good reason, is that Pete Seeger was in some sense a Stalinist in the contemporary sense of the word. The contemporary meaning his contemporary sense of the word, which is that he had his eye on the Russian experiment, or whatever you want to call that, which of course turned out to not be successful. And
hindsight kind of screwed him on that one a little bit.
They turned out to be, Stalin turned out to be this brutal, awful, horrible, one of the worst, dictators in the history of the world. But that doesn't mean the notion of communism and the notions of communism and socialism are bunk because this one evil person did it badly.
Yeah.
But that's it. So what American communism was in that part of the century was this, force on the far left that was really attempting to effect change through democracy. Yeah. It wasn't attempting violent overthrow of the government. It wasn't that. It was basically trying to push what became the ideas of FDR's New Deal kind of deeper into sort of the fabric of American society. You know, so before the New Deal, it was sort of, you know, it was what became sort of FDR's New Deal in a lot of ways. But then, you know, in the years after World War II, it was really trying to, like, keep those ideas going, that the government could be and should be, you know, a force to make everybody equal, to create equality in society.
Yeah, there's a quote you pulled from Jackie Robinson, just how any idea that was just progressive, they were deeming communist.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was kind of blanketed in that way.
And that's really one of the ways that this era that era, the 40s and the 50s, is similar to now.
Yes, exactly.
Which is that it's
just draw that parallel.
Yeah, exactly. Things just get sort of blurred.
Yeah. They're smearing with words that kind of just don't mean exactly what they're
right. Exactly.
mean. And, I need to ask before we go too much further the level of research and kind of the process and what goes on in here. This book, I mean, not only does it cover the Weavers, it covers the history of folk music and the just the American history of the time. It's deep. What how long, when did you start this? Tell me a little bit about the process if you could.
I mean, yeah. I guess I started it really officially like right a few weeks after the 2016 election, okay. So probably the beginning of December 2016 is when
did Pete Seeger die? Was that
he died in 2013, I think.
Okay,
or 14.
I think Fred was the last one alive in 16.
Yeah,
okay.
He passed away really not long before. Like I kind of began to revisit the project, and Ronnie passed away. Ronnie Gilbert passed away like a year before that.
Yeah. But yeah, sorry to interrupt.
So I knew a pretty decent framework for the history of folk music in this country. I'm a music fan and a music writer.
Yeah.
But really, my own knowledge of folk music kind of begins kind of in the 60s, or it did. It kind of began in the 60s, besides knowing kind of my general image of the Weavers. My detailed history of folk music probably begins with Bob Dylan arriving in New York. I knew a little bit of what happened before that.
It shows up in the book later on.
Yeah, exactly. It shows up in like the last chapter, basically. Really cool. So this is sort of prequel style.
The Beatles are showing up at the end. It's real neat. Yeah.
And that's another thing that I wanted to sort of connect it up to kind of what we think of as the beginnings of contemporary music. But
and how they influenced those beginnings. Yeah.
But research-wise, one of the very first things I did was, just kind of track down, like, the histories of folk music from before the 60s and kind of create a framework for my understanding of that, for what the Communist Party was and how folk music fit into that. And, that was part of the idea all along, is that the Weavers and the members of the Weavers tell the story of folk music, in that they were there, kind of from the moment that it kind of this notion of people in the city playing folk music, of this of contemporary people sort of diving into music that was seemingly hundreds of years old, and that idea of taking this very old music and using it for modern purposes. That's one of the conversations that really begins with Pete Seeger and really begins with Lee Hayes, who is the co-founder of the Weavers. So that was the first step. It's just sort of giving myself like a framework
just
for
background
just the background, start taking notes, start making chronologies of like, when the various Pete Seeger's various earlier, projects existed. And once I kind of had that framework was when I started feeling comfortable like going deeper, because, I wanted to have this background for when I started going through archives and papers and things where if I found a document, I could know what it meant, as opposed to just like, oh, here's this thing that looks kind of interesting.
And then going back and forth. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So it would be like, oh, I know where this falls into the story. So the next step was kind of going through publicly accessible documents. Which
oh, thank you. Got it.
Included like the Daily Worker, which was the communist newspaper in New York City during the 40s. In the early 50s, and going through Pete Seeger's FBI file, which is...
wow, did you get a look?
Yeah, well, it's on archive.org.
Okay.
So it's 10,000, somewhere between like 10 and 20,000 pages. It all sort of blurs together after 10,000 pages. But that was a solid few weeks, like basically just reading through this many thousands of pages and taking notes and trying to like just, frame all that stuff. Unfortunately, the requests that I put in for the other Weaver's FBI files, Fred's, I believe, was destroyed in some flood. Lee's is... and Lee's and Ronnie's, I think, still do exist, but the thing is, even if I had put in my requests on, like, the day that my editor said, yes, we're doing this book, like, I still wouldn't have them back by now. So I still haven't gotten their files back. I'm still, like, at some random day, and, like, I imagine it to be, like, in the next 2 years from now.
Like, shows up at the door.
Or, yeah, well, Ronnie's is, like, apparently, like, 10,000 pages or something. Like, it's, like, a lot, and... sometimes FBI files are cross-referenced, so if there's, like, one, you know, I don't think this is going to be what it is, but sometimes it's like, oh, if Pete Seeger is mentioned in somebody's file, then, like, a good chunk of his file will then be duplicated and made redundant. So anyway, it's hard to know. So those were all the things that were publicly accessible, and then it was, you know, start hunting for things that aren't publicly accessible. Two of the Weaver's kids are around and were very helpful. Caleb Hellerman, who's Fred Hellerman's son, turned out to be a Dead fan and a fan of Yola Tengo, nice. and you know, he's a few years older than me, but we have a lot in common. So he was totally, you know, he had actually already read both of my previous books, which kind of blew my mind. So he was totally on board with, like, you know, I went up to where he grew up in Connecticut, where Fred lived, and went through their attic and found, you know, all of Fred's, like, letters from the Coast Guard, and, like, a journal. That was the coolest thing.
I was going to ask if you caught some journals, because
so the coolest
real deep insight.
So the coolest thing that we found there was a journal that Fred kept. I'm guessing he probably knew the Weavers were going to be signed at that point. It was like from late 1949, might have even been like early 1950. There were, you know, there's no date on it. But my sense is that he was, like, trying to write things down because he knew that this was now going to be a thing that he was going to be involved with for a while. And that was pretty amazing because it's like his pre-fame, pre-Blacklist, pre-everything insights into kind of the Weavers, just the Weavers dynamics, which is, you know, it's all kinds of stuff in there. You know, a lot of really evocative personal stuff about Lee Hayes, who's a really, you know, he's a pretty complex, troubled guy. He was an alcoholic. He was, you know, it's hard to say this definitively, you know, when he died, you know, so many years ago. But he was probably gay. He grew up in the deep South in the early part of the century. His father was a minister, and, you know, he never had any relationships. He was basically asexual. That was sort of how people tended to describe him. But things get complicated. That was sort of what I found out, is that you don't see those things even in the letters. Those are kinds of things that are sort of like, you know, you kind of have to talk to people about that, because that was just something that didn't really get written down, sort of people's thoughts or whatever. So, I mean, I was trying to be very sensitive to that, kind of like looking around these documents. Anyway, so some of those things are in Fred's journal. And then Ronnie's daughter, Lisa, is around. She lives in California, and Ronnie's papers are incredible. Ronnie was an amazing archivist. She kept all of her letters and kept them, I don't know if she kept them organized, but she later in her life, maybe she organized them, and they're all really well organized now. It's like 1940s business papers, you know, Weaver's correspondence, you know. And I spent 3 days at Lisa's house just going through, not all of them, because like I kind of had to stop after the Weavers broke up, but just going into all these letters and, like, just, oh my God, just, you know, daily detail. I'll come back to those in a second. And then the last big piece of sort of non-public research is this collector named Barry Ullman, he's kind of the world's biggest Woody Guthrie paper collector, like collects, like, letters and journals, and has a bunch of Weaver stuff as well. And I visited with him, and he had a lot of Woody Guthrie letters, which were amazing to see, but that was definitely like a sort of a side wormhole.
Yeah, exactly.
That was like, I can't get sucked into Woody World.
Though there was Woody book real fast.
Yeah, I mean, then there's certainly no shortage of those. But there was one Woody letter from 1950 that mentions the Weavers that I did get to quote in the book.
Oh.
The main thing that Barry had was he knew Fred as well, Fred Hellerman, and acquired a bunch of papers and stuff from Fred. Probably in the 90s, would be my guess. Contracts and letters, and the main thing that he had that was just exploded my brain open was this tour journal that Fred kept on the first Weavers tour, which was 1951, like January to June 1951, I think was the tour, and basically the journal, where he kept almost day by day, like really detailed, like just, here's where we stayed, here's who we partied with after the show, here's what we did on our off days, and it was just like, I can't, I would just, if I had like that for every Weavers concert, it would just be like, it would be too much probably.
Yeah, it's turned into an anthology real quick.
Right, but at the same time, it was just like, there was so much in there that like I couldn't even use all the good stuff unless... Like, the book would have been that chapter on that tour would have been, like, disproportionately enormous. Yeah. But the main thing that I pulled out of those journals was really a missing piece that I'd found references to elsewhere. There's, like, a passing reference to this in the Dunaway Pete Seeger biography. There's a passing reference to this in Eric Darling's memoir, which is this incident where Pete Seeger smashed a banjo. Mm-hmm. And if, like, reading those things in his biography, it's, like, really, like, a couple of sentences, and it's got, Pete Seeger was a storyteller, mm-hmm. and a lot of times I think he would boil stories down to their morals and, and sort of look for the, just look for the moral, look for the lesson, look for the whatever. So this is one of those stories that when he told it, he boiled it down to this one sentence, like, oh, we were backstage somewhere, and the other Weavers, they're like, hey, Pete, you should have a drink with us. And I was like, no, I don't drink. And they're like, no, have a drink. And I said, really, I don't drink. And I got up and I smashed my banjo through a table. And that's how serious I was about not drinking. And that's sort of how he presented that story later on, which is not totally untrue.
Yeah.
It is. So... I found the missing pieces to this story in Ronnie's papers and Fred's journal. Fred, in his journal, tells it blow by blow. Mm-hmm. It probably written within, like, the hour of it happening. Like, back in the hotel room, just, like, it's pages and pages of, like, then this happened, and then Pete got up and smashed. It happened during, like, a backstage jam session. And, this happened, and then... Pete ran out of room, and then Toshi, his wife, ran after him, and then Ronnie. It's everything. It's just like, oh my god, I can't believe how detailed this is. And then I found that I don't remember exactly what order this was in. Maybe Lisa told me about this in advance because I sort of knew this was something I was trying to find more details about. Mm-hmm. But then there's a letter in Ronnie's papers. There's no date on it, and there's no mention of any banjo smash or any specifics about this incident, but it's a resignation letter from the band. It's an unsent resignation letter, and it's probably like 10 or 12 pages, and it's all handwritten on hotel stationery.
There was multiple unsent letters.
Right?
Yeah, she would write out her.
So they were all letter writers. Yeah. This was the 50s, and they're all extremely literate people.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times they weren't living in, after the initial years of the Weavers, they were all living in different places. So letter writing became this form of, not became this form of communication. It was just their medium.
That's how Lee aired a lot of his grievances.
Right, in front of a typewriter, right? Anyway, but all this Ronnie letter, and there's no context for it other than the hotel stationery. That's like the only thing that's like you can pin it on, and sort of finding these pieces like, oh, that's definitely what she's writing about here, and it was just like all of a sudden I had this story kind of that had like this one intense, cathartic, important part of Weaver's history where I had basically all the different voices in the story,
different perspectives, and able to piece together the story. Yeah,
and it was it's a bummer that I didn't get to interview any of the Weavers. I mean, I interviewed Pete, maybe 2000.
Oh, did you?
When did I interview Pete?
Yeah.
2006, 2005, somewhere a lot for Relix, actually, hilariously, about technology and changing copyright. It was, it was a fine interview. It wasn't that long.
Yeah.
He sort of said the things I expected him to say. He gave me the quotes that I needed.
Yeah.
But then after we finished talking and doing the interview, we just kept talking about other stuff. He was really just curious, just about stuff. And that was like, I got my Pete Seeger there. Like
That's
he
nice.
I don't even remember what the term was, how we got to start talking about Brazil. I think I was really into Brazilian music at the time. I started talking about public transportation systems in Brazil, and Gilberto Gil, who's a great dissident Brazilian musician from the 60s, who had been jailed in the 60s. At that point, had just been made the Minister of Culture in Brazil. It was kind of this, sort of liberal moment there. Before the current,
things have done changed.
Things have sure changed. Yeah, right. But he came up, and I don't know why Pete had this thought. He's like, "Oh, could you connect me to him or something?" And it's like, I don't know Gilberto Gil.
Who do you think I am?
Well, but then I realized, okay, I knew only very casually, because I'd interviewed him and emailed with him, John Perry Barlow, who's the Grateful Dead, who's a Grateful Dead lyricist, and was extremely good friends with Gilberto Gil.
John knew everybody.
Yeah, he really did. And so I wrote him an email, and I'm like, well, I just interviewed Pete Seeger, and he wants to get in touch. How should he do that? And Barlow, he's like, okay, well, here's
I guess Pete was right asking the right man.
Yeah, cool. Apparently. And like, he sent me back like, oh, here's his home number, here's his office number, here's his address, and Pete didn't have email, so I put that in a letter, sent it off to Pete. And Pete and I sent postcards. I have a couple. No, that's Al Jardine. Yeah, there's a postcard from Pete.
No way. He's thanking you for the address of Gilberto Gil.
Yeah. See, right?
He draws the banjo.
He signed that in all of them.
Wasn't there one where he drew a picture of the banjo in the book
with like shackles on it?
With shackles on it. Yeah,
he the banjo signing letters with the banjo was kind of his little doodle thing. Like he obviously you can see on this he just knew how to do it.
That's when he was having a problem with commercialism, right?
Yeah, yes. There's a bunch of different you see different variations
of the banjo sign.
There's one with the banjo snapped in half. There's one with the ball and chain on it. Anyway, I interviewed Gil a few years later, and I asked him about it. He's like, "Oh yeah, Pete Seeger definitely he got in touch with me." So like, I consider that one of my life achievements.
Totally,
was connecting Brazilian and American political dissidents.
Nice.
Political
I didn't expect to come up on that in this discussion. That's so cool. What a cool aside.
So yeah, those were some of my. I wish I could have spoken to the other Weavers because there's so many questions I could have. Harold Leventhal, their manager.
I almost wouldn't have been surprised if you had when I asked that question because of how thorough everything.
They were just Lee died in 1981, so obviously couldn't talk to him. His I forgot to mention that his letters are all in the Smithsonian. Oh wow. And all digitized.
Oh cool.
So that was another.
I'd love to get my hands on some of those.
Yeah, those are you can see those.
Fiery soul.
You can see those on the Smithsonian on the. Well, I don't know if it's down for the shutdown right now, but the Smithsonian folk, is it the Ralph Rinsler archives are online. So all of Lee's letters are scanned in. They're not searchable. You have to kind of like go through the files and look at them. But that was amazing too. Yeah. But man, I there's so many. I wish I could have hung out with all four of them. Oddly, Pete is maybe the exception to this in some ways, but the other three of them really all seem like modern people in some ways. Like they would be totally with every contemporary political conversation. Yep. Maybe they wouldn't be up on technology or something like that, but like just their souls and just something about their attitudes is so modern and so just accepting of, in some ways, of things that I feel like it would have been, even though they were, decades older than me, I feel like it wouldn't have been hard to speak with them.
Yeah, cool. Hey, so I want to kind of get into the music a little bit just kind of the inception of the Weavers and everything. You started in on the Weavers real early just from your parents, but something attracted you at that point early on. But what would you say makes the Weavers' music so special? Because it is special. I mean, who it influenced is amazing.
I mean, to me, I guess there'd be two things that I would point to. One is a few musical factors that are sort of entwined. Their harmonies, are kind of the big.
That was the first thing that I wrote down about it.
That was what grabbed me when I was little.
I think that's what was grabbing everyone. And anytime someone would be talking about them, they'd just be like, I've never heard anything the way they harmonized. Yeah,
right. And it was just there was just an enthusiasm to it and an energy to it, and the fact that they could sing. But only Ronnie was really a trained voice. The others were sort of, folk singers. But they just had a blend that they were really able to sing together in this way that just, when their voices stacked together, there was just this energy that pushed through. And I've made this comparison a bunch when talking about this. But in some ways, there is kind of like a Beatles thing there. In the sense that, like, the Beatles had these amazing harmonies, and they stack together, and they're singing, like, She Loves You, yeah, 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 yeah. Excuse me, don't want to get too many yeahs there. But there's also kind of like a bigger message behind that, or a bigger energy behind that, where there is something, with the Beatles anyway, sort of generational words, the harmonies, but there's something being pushed through the harmonies that you're kind of hearing in between that. And the Weavers are the same, where there's these harmonies, but there's kind of this bigger thing that, like, there's fighting harmonies. I don't know what you want to call them. Yeah. There was like just this radical energy to them that I think does come through. And the other part of the Weavers that made them special, and I think the harmonies definitely accentuated this, was their choice of repertoire. Nobody was doing what the Weavers did in the early 1950s, really, until they started doing it. Which was looking around the world for music and looking for influences in different countries and mainly looking for songs from anywhere, as long as the songs were good. And, you kind of look at the songs that the Weavers had top 10 hits or top 20 hits with, and there's a lot of them. They were really
raging up the charts.
And that's something that is fascinating to me, is that they were an enormous pop band, and people just kind of forget that. Because this was, for a few reasons, but mainly because it was the 1950s, and who really remembers pop music from the 50s? Yeah. But they were, they were a charting act, and the songs that they were bringing into the charts were, Sena Sena Sena, which is, Sena 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 from Israel. They were bringing Wemaway from South Africa. They were bringing Goodnight Irene, which is an American folk song, by Lead Belly, which they learned on the Lower East Side. So that's sort of, comparably speaking, local to them. Yep. And they're singing, Sloop John B, or I guess it was the Wreck of the John B at that point, which was from the Bahamas. So they're pulling music from around the world, which is not what pop musicians did at that point.
Yeah, which is also remarkable that they were, making into the charts and did get signed eventually. Because I guess there's that one Decca, am I saying right? Yeah. Decca executive. He's like, these guys are singing Hebrew music. How is this going to work? So that makes it even more special. I think one more thing that I would add to your 2 points you added that you touch on is also that the music is communal. It was kind of like, especially when they were playing live, and they were a live band, as you alluded to, which is so cool. A lot of the music I know we both love, that we can kind of point to the same thing. You got to go see them live. But it wasn't that they were just singing to the people. It was a sing-along.
Yeah.
And that's exciting.
So jumping forward a bit, I talked to the last chapter of the book. I really wanted to trace the connections of the Weavers to the present moment, or to the beginnings of what we think of the contemporary music. And I knew the Beach Boys, for example, had been influenced by the Weavers. They did Sloop John B, which they learned from the Kingston Trio, which the Kingston Trio learned from the Weavers. I knew, David Crosby was a Weavers fan. The one that I didn't know was a Weavers fan was Jerry Garcia.
Yeah.
Which was,
So did you not come upon that recording of him singing? Wasn't at the time.
That was way at the end of the process. That was,
okay.
Wow. That was really in the last phases of the process. And this will segue right back to what we were talking about a second ago. But right near the end of the writing, that Before the Dead box set came out that has all of but a lot of Garcia's recordings from before he was in the Dead, like all of his folk projects and his bluegrass stuff. And the earliest one on there is a tape of him playing at a party with Robert Hunter, a birthday party for Jerry's then girlfriend. You can see hear some of that in the Long Strange Trip documentary. And on the recording, someone makes a joke about the Weavers. And I got in touch with the producer of one of the producers of the box set, who I know, who connected me with Bridget, and she's like, "Oh yeah, you just let him hear the whole thing." So I got to hear the whole tape, and when you hear the whole tape, the majority of the songs on that recording of Jerry and Hunter, Jerry's 18, I think Hunter's maybe 19. The majority of the songs came from the Weavers. If not directly, then they're songs that the Weavers sort of brought into the world, into the contemporary, repertoire. And I talked to Bridget, and she was like, "Oh yeah, we loved the Weavers." And there were a lot of things they loved about the Weavers. But the thing that made me think of it just now, but she said that the Weavers were, for them, the group that made it clear that there was a difference between going to see a concert and sitting as a passive member of the audience, and going to see a concert where you're a participant and there's kind of this open loop between the stage and the audience. And when you're going to the concert, you're sort of entering into the milieu of the concert, and you're meeting other like-minded people from kind of that world. And it's just to me, it's obvious that there's parallels between that world and kind of what
but
the
it's
dead
cool to see the genesis, or when someone kind of figured out that this was something
a thing.
It's a thing.
And the Weavers, in some way, they're, like I said, they were my favorite group when I was a kid, and in some ways they are kids' music. That's pop music. They're not singing radical political songs. They're singing songs with great harmonies and great choruses. And at least during their early years when they were on the singles, all this, on the hit parade, all these songs had huge string arrangements and whatever. It's pop music.
Yep.
So it's not that surprising that Garcia, not jettisoned the Weavers, but sort of you don't see them coming through. It's hard. You don't necessarily see the Weavers coming through that much further into his career after that. There's some songs that he would sing that you could sort of trace back, but for the most part, the Weavers seemed like they were kind of like a base level for him, like a beginning. He had just gotten out of the army. He was just learning how to play guitar. And the Weavers were kind of like the core of the folk repertoire. Song basic would be the word we would use now. On Top of Old Smoky, or these songs that are just like so common that almost like who cares about him now? Because who cares about On Top of Old Smoky? But that was a hit for the Weavers.
Yeah.
Someone had to bring that into the pop consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we got to talk about protest music some, because as much as it was pop music, as you were just saying, Pete believed deeply in the power of music for change, and we see it kind of protests and social commentary in music often now, whether it's reggae, hip hop, and beyond. But they kind of brought this to the foreground a little bit. I mean, I'm sure it was in jazz and a lot of other music outside of pop and rock, but they were on the foundation of this. Is that right?
Yeah, it's complicated. They absolutely were. The Weavers, you can trace the Weavers family tree back to this group called the Almanac Singers, which was Pete Seeger and Lee Hayes and Woody Guthrie, and other musicians. But those are sort of the three that are, I guess, relevant to the Weavers story. They lived communally in New York in the 40s, and they were basically singing the headlines. Pete was a Communist Party member. Woody was an extremely committed Communist Party member. And they were singing topical songs based on the party line at the time, which got really complicated as World War II ramped up, and all these alliances between Russia and Germany and the United States were shifting around. And that got them into a lot of trouble. And they had to scrap their repertoire. Yeah. They had all these songs that they were singing that were newspaper headlines. They just couldn't do them anymore. Yeah. And they got red baited and basically blacklisted. The Almanac Singers more or less had to
shut it down for that reason.
Yeah, or they kind of went back underground. There was a moment at the beginning of World War II where they were being featured on Armed Services Radio and stuff like that, but that all sort of disappeared. After World War II, Pete was in the Army. Woody was in the Merchant Marine, and then briefly in the Army. After World War II, they kind of get back to New York and sort of reassess. And they form an organization called People's Songs. That was Pete's big dream. Was this big thing that was bigger than, you know, individual musicians or bands.
Would you call it a collective?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was a company, an organization, or something like that. Yeah, collective, totally. Where the idea was they would be keeping track of all of these songs. Like if you needed a Union song or you needed, you know.
How many people's songs are there? Like, I mean, because as you're going through, when you put a song.
Oh, I put the numbers.
Songs, numbers,
Yeah,
I mean, or just whereabouts.
There's probably like 300 of them or something. You know, they lasted from what, 19? They lasted right until the beginning of the Weavers, so like 46 to the end of 48 maybe?
Yeah.
40, yeah, they lasted until right after the Henry Wallace campaign, which was right at the beginning of the Weavers. So People Song, also committed to singing all these topical songs, singing about, you know, like that, like there was a special songbook, and so they put out a you know, newsletter every month or two that had all the newest songs. You know, it would be like the Office of Price Administration, which was like a New Deal thing to keep prices balanced during the war, was being dismantled. And they had a whole special emergency section of songs that could, you know, just for singing to keep the OPA open. But that sort of not dried up, but became problematic as well. The peak of People Songs was 1948, probably. They were involved in Henry Wallace's third-party candidacy for president in 1948.
Yeah, he had been all in on that one,
Yeah, he had been FDR's vice president for, I don't remember which term, maybe the first two terms, and then got jettisoned by FDR because he was actually too left-wing, too progressive. So he becomes this presidential candidate, and they throw, you know, he's basically the Bernie of the time or something like that. And they go, like you said, they go all in on it. They're writing songs for it, but this is also the period when like the loyalty oaths are starting in, and you know, communists are being arrested on Smith Act charges. The Smith Act basically equated, if you were a communist, you were automatically assumed that you wanted to violently overthrow the government, and therefore basically made communism illegal. So all this stuff is going down, and there's kind of an attrition rate in People Songs where it's like, you know, it just doesn't quite, you know, people are sort of moving away from it. Clearly, like, the left is not the place to be at this point.
Becomes dangerous.
Yeah, it did.
Absolutely.
Physically.
There's a lot of bravery in those moments.
You know, this is a little bit after People Songs, but summer of 1949, one of the the Weavers didn't sing at it, but they were supposed to. There was, you know, this event in Peekskill, New York, which turned into a race riot, basically.
That's wild. Very cinematic chapter. That's intense. Yeah.
That Paul Robeson, the great black opera singer.
It's great how much Paul is in this too.
Yeah,
he was great to learn more about Paul.
He was a figure that I only knew about because my grandma, who passed away last year, swooned about him whenever he came up. She was you know, she saw him once at a party, and she, like, clearly, like, whenever her heart, she turned into a little teenage girl whenever Paul Robeson came up. He
seemed like an amazing human being.
Yeah. Anyway, so they got, you know, he sang at this event in upstate New York, and they got, or not upstate, but Peekskill, and they got literally stoned. They had rocks thrown at them by locals.
Yeah, the police were just literally standing by.
So really not a good situation for what you would call a protest singers. So the Weavers grew out of that, and they were a very conscious attempt they wanted to sing, they wanted their music to, I can't remember, they wanted it to be for the people of Peekskill. They wanted, that was who
for the people who were throwing
the stones. They wanted to reach that audience with their music.
And he still believed in the power of music in that way. He's like, I don't need to kind of be as topical. The music's going to get through. I need to get it into their homes. So, I need to get them to hear it. Yeah.
So the idea was that they were going to be singing these sort of timeless songs that didn't have overt political content. It wasn't, you know, they were singing about this cause or the other, but there was clearly this bigger curriculum behind them, or this bigger message behind them, where when you are singing songs, like I said, from the Bahamas, from, you know, from South Africa, from apartheid era South Africa, from Israel, the new country of Israel, from the American South, from all these places, there was a bigger message that you convey with that repertoire. And that, in a sense, the Weavers weren't protest singers because they weren't protesting, like, you know, direct causes like that, I've been thinking of them as like organizing the singers. It's like organizing music. It's like, you know, this music brings people together around the songs and around the melodies and around these ideas, and then once you're together, that's sort of when the real thing happens. And it's not necessarily like, and so for me, you know, there's obviously great protest songs, but I guess I do sometimes think about protest music as almost a reductive way to think about the value of music and social justice and social action, which is to say that, you know, I think it oversimplifies it to say that you can have a song and that the song, if enough people sing the song, it'll affect change on this cause. It's like sort of thinking about music as like a catapult or a slingshot or like a very like single direction weapon, you know, something like that. Whereas to me, music, the real like longer value of music in terms of social organizing is as this thing that connects people and brings them together in a way that demonstrates their shared values and is a way for people to access that.
Like a larger culture war type of thing.
Yeah, and connect with that. Yeah. So that's where...
Eye-opening in a way they might not even understand. And communal and...
So the Weavers' music was dangerous, but not in necessarily the way that
the Almanac and things before protest music can be.
Yeah, not even necessarily the way that like the government was framing it as dangerous. Yep. It wasn't like you're being indoctrinated with specific messages to overthrow the government. It was like...
That is the way they were framing it. They were saying there was Aesopian language in there that was you know, telling people, even when they were singing to children, that that they were to overthrow the government.
And it's and that's not what the message was.
That's not what was going on.
The message was equality. The message was peace. The message was you know, all this kind of hippie stuff.
Yeah, all kind of beautiful stuff.
Yeah.
What I thought, and you were kind of alluding to it there, was you know, a lot of the music they would have, it would be topical at first and actually just like basically singing the headlines and such. But what was really unique to me was how non-precious they were with the lyrics and how they would change them. Also, with folk music too, is how this is kind of me just coming to grips with understanding folk music through your book, but how they would all, you know, kind of cover each other, and they're just all playing these same songs, and like they're all like different versions are going up the charts at the same time. Folk music is a peculiar beast,
right? No, for sure, and that was something that was fascinating to think about. Was that, you know, folk music, I guess, is often thought of as this, you know, very traditional thing. Like you're trying to preserve this thing that happened hundreds of years ago in the same, you know, this music, and this is how it was authentically performed by the people who wrote it. And the members of the Weavers were interested in tracing the sources of these songs. Like, oh yeah, this song originated in Arkansas in the 1920s and that kind of stuff. But they were more interested in like adapting it for current use and sort of seeing what it could be in the present sense. And that's, you know, that's part of protest music, but that's part of pop music as well, is kind of, you know, adapting things and making them contemporary. And you're right. There was virtually zero preciousness about it. There was a sense of taste and a sense of aesthetics and a sense of, you know, what sounded good and what was, you know, cheesy or what was, you know, chintzy. You know, to be fair, they did cross into that when they got into the pop world. Yeah.
Begrudgingly at points too.
Yeah.
They were struggling with that. That's another fun thing about this book, is seeing how much they struggled with commercialism and just kind of getting into the pop scene to try to make a living. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So it is very blurry, this idea of what folk music is, and was to the Weavers in that era.
And protest music. I'm curious, do you feel that Pete, he just seemed like the most idealistic, am I right about that, of all of them? Yeah.
Unquestionably.
Did he become, and he believes so much in the power of music, do you feel he became jaded later on with the power of music, or is he always, did he remain idealistic and believe that power of the music to change things?
You know, it's hard for me to answer that definitively, only because I never really knew the guy.
Sure.
And my impression is that he was actually kind of a hard person to know.
That's something that you mentioned multiple times. Yeah,
tried to convey that a little bit. That He was really enthusiastic.
I don't even think his wife knew him. Like,
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no. He was really enthusiastic and really positive and just this force for things, but was also had a hard time connecting to people emotionally.
Yep.
So, to answer that question, publicly,
yes.
Pete was definitely had not lost a single iota of his belief in the power of music by the end of his life. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there were moments where cynicism came out about it, or he had regrets about it, or, in his darker moments, probably, was questioning things. But but Pete Seeger, until, how he lived to be 98 or something.
Yeah.
He was. The last time I saw him play live was at an anti-war march in 2003, I guess, in the run up to the Gulf War. And his voice was gone. He was really leading the crowd. I couldn't even really hear him, but I could see him. He was a tiny figure, like 10, 12 blocks away. It was this huge anti-war march, and I could see him like waving his arms, and I could hear him scratching through the PA. And it was his energy, and his energy definitely survived.
The reason I just find him so inspiring. I mean, I think he was at Occupy, or at least. That's remarkable. That means the entire time through the 50s, through the 40s, all the way through our current times, he was there, fighting.
Yeah, totally. I mean, he's not. Harry Belafonte is another person that he's someone I wish I could have talked to for this. Yep. He's not as accessible these days, and I think I'm not sure how he's doing, but but he's another figure, very much like Pete Seeger, who's been completely engaged for, just more than half a century at this point. And so like that is inspiring. It's like, wow, that is like life commitment. You are a lifer.
You're in. It shows what you really believe in. It shows that he was truly passionate. Kind of an aside. Am I right that you throw a couple like pop culture references of your own in on your writing? Did I see like a Lebowski thing?
Oh, there's probably a Lebowski. Which one? What are you thinking?
There was one point where he's like, "That's like your opinion." Did I read into that? Or something?
Yeah, I probably.
I think there was a couple gems in there. I saw.
Yeah, there's. Yes, good eye. There are a few. There's probably even a few that aren't even overt references to things that are
dug into your language or your.
Yeah, I mean that one would definitely be overt. But there are things that I would have to go back and look. But I'm sure there are things that are in all of my books that are
Easter eggs
that wouldn't even read as a reference to something unless you were me, and it's like sometimes I'm just imitating the rhythm of something or referencing. But yes, there's definitely big Lebowski references in there.
Yeah, there's cool stuff in there. In another question,
there's a lot of Twin Peaks too.
Is there? Mm-hmm. Oh, I almost want to read it with that in mind. Their influence was just way more than I even imagined. Bruce Springsteen ended up putting out an album, Pitchfork, right?
Yeah. No Weavers on there though, I don't think.
No Weavers. And Peter, Paul, and Mary was a big thing. Yeah. You mentioned Mary met one of the artists, one of the other.
Yeah, she met Peter Yarrow at one.
I think it was the first Carnegie Hall show.
Yeah,
or one of the Carnegie Hall shows.
Yeah, in the reunion show in the end of 1956. That was where.
That's where I think your book is so kind of, important in ways, is because the Weavers, I don't think were given the credit that they do for these influences are vast. Joan Baez, down the list, it's crazy.
And a lot of it, I think, is that the 60s happened, and Bob Dylan happened, which was this complete realignment of what folk music was. Yeah. So the Weavers were a folk pop band, right? They were cleaning these songs up to get them on the radio. They were putting on string arrangements. That was their goal, and they weren't trying to play this sort of hard-edged, authentic, quote-unquote, authentic folk music. The notion of being, sort of out-of-tune banjos and sort of rough harmonies, that kind of began into scent in, after the Weavers started. The Anthology of American Folk Music came out in 1952. The New Lost City Ramblers are another important part of that. They sort of came around in the later 50s. And at that point, folk music sort of starts to split almost into two parts, where you've got kind of the folk pop part of it, and you've got kind of this raw-edged, what do they call it, like neo-ethnic, I guess was one way they would, that was one of the buzz phrases for it in that era. And Bob Dylan definitely fell into the neo-ethnic camp, despite the fact that he became this enormous pop artist. And that mode of folk music really overtook the in terms of the hardcore folk scene, kind of overtook the Weavers' approach to folk music in the 1960s. And in that way, when Bob Dylan went electric, in some ways kind of wiped the Weavers out of people's minds. Like, that's sort of the Dylan goes electric moment. But to me, that is only part of the story. That's, that takes, in some ways, that takes the Weavers out of the dialogue of folk music. Mm-hmm. But at that same moment, when Dylan goes electric, you kind of have this new blooming of pop music and rock music that's not rock and it's not folk, but is this thing that to me really clearly derives from what the Weavers were doing. And a lot of it's super cheesy, but like you hear, all this music from the 60s and 70s and stuff that's, folk pop.
Yeah.
That's, I'm trying to think of what a great example of that would be. Even things like maybe like Judy Collins or something like that, or probably even eventually, stuff like Joni Mitchell, where it's not, you're not trying to channel this like raw, hard folk edge. You're trying to create music that's pleasing. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's the Weavers created that dialogue of like trying to create music that's both like authentic to the self, but also, pop.
Accessible.
And accessible. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Made me think a lot when I was reading the book, just because, I'm going through the history of folk music, really, and just how much this is also a book that contains so much American history. Yeah. And I just kept thinking about the idea that you could look at the history of American music as just how it like crosses into the history of America.
Yeah.
And just how music, can define what's going on in the times and the story it's telling. And it's wild.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this does bring it back to Pete Seeger. I'm trying to look where that the postcard. Mm-hmm. So this postcard that he sent me, it says how to build global community on the front, and it's this list of 20 items, and right at the top of the list is a couple items. Imagine other cultures through their poetry and novels. Listen to music you don't understand. Dance to it. And there's a lot of really good stuff here. Notice the workings of power and privilege in your culture. This is a great card. But reading those,
so woke.
Well, exactly, right? But reading this card, it's like, oh yeah, that was how the Weavers were exactly how I got my interest in listening to music from all different places and different. They really defined for me, even without knowing it, the idea that you should listen to lots of different stuff.
Yep.
But it wasn't even really, I don't know when it was. Maybe it was this card. It was probably around the time I was listening to Gilberto Gil and Brazilian music. But the idea that you can understand countries and the history of the world through the music of those countries. And to me, that became a way, and is a way, of understanding other cultures in kind of this like level playing field sort of way. It's like, to me, I feel like because of who I am, and I assume a lot of people that I know and friends of mine, it's a lot easier to understand a country through their recordings than it is through trying to understand their parliamentary politics or these kind of like other issues. And for me, it's like if you discover a country's musicians and then you discover their music and go into their music, you see what their concerns are and like what their political concerns are, what their economic concerns are, what their artistic concerns are.
I could say you could almost take the idea of just music and just say their art. And see,
exactly.
To find out the art of a culture, you could really learn so much.
And that was like a really eye-opening thing for me, was knowing that that's like, there are people, and and I have to assume this is true, that there are people like me and like you in, music fans in these other countries.
It creates connection, it creates empathy, you see them as people, just like you said, like you.
And it's like, that's, in understanding another country, it's like, that's the part of another country's history that I want to connect to. It's like, what are the equivalents?
What are the like minds?
Who are the heads, basically?
Who are the heads? What are they listening to? What are they into? What can they teach me about what's going on in their world?
Right, like the people who I assume it's like
Love it.
Who is aligned somewhat like me in that culture.
And what are they thinking? What are they fighting against?
And then, like,
what
to me,
dealing with?
Yeah, and like once you understand that, it's like it's not like the whole culture comes into view around that, but I know a lot more about Brazilian history and Brazilian politics because I got into Brazilian music.
Yeah. Something.
And the Weavers for me were where that notion began and where I probably indirectly learned to do that.
Amazing.
And maybe consciously learned. I don't know.
That's
awesome.
awesome.
It's hard to figure out where exactly when and where all these ideas started for me, but they're pretty entwined with those things.
Well, I love this book. It's there's so much discussed. I mean, cultural appropriation is addressed, the rise of they even talk about LSD therapy.
Right, oh God, I forgot. Yeah,
famed actor Alan Arkin plays a huge role. The rise of the LP, just the just like kind of live music. All this is in there, and at the heart of it, sings the idea that the world can change through a song. So it's really, really great work. I love talking about this book. I couldn't recommend it more to people.
And a lot of it was really just an attempt to be optimistic in the face of just awful stuff that was happening. Like
combating this nonsense with art and
or
perspective.
Exactly. Just sort of like having this thing to connect with. And so one of the starting points, the second starting points for the book when I revisited the Weavers after the election, there's a great documentary also called "Wasn't That a Time?" It's kind of an irresistible title, but it was shot.
It's high on my to-do list right now to watch after I read
filmed, this. They reunite. The Weavers reunited in 1980 for a couple of shows at Carnegie Hall. It was made into this great film. It's actually really hard to see right now. It is on YouTube.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay.
It is on YouTube, but you can't. I don't think it's on. I don't think you can get it through Netflix or anything like that.
Yep.
I mean, definitely can't get it through Netflix.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can even buy like a new copy on DVD or anything. But so they reunited in 1980, and the concerts happened to be at the end of November 1980, which is 3 weeks after the 1980 presidential election, which is really this turn back into conservatism after more or less decades of liberalism. You give or take Richard Nixon. But Lee Hayes says something during that film that which is that this too shall pass.
This too shall pass.
I've had kidney stones and I should know.
Yeah.
And it was just like yes, thank you. And it was like this really like sweet, touching. It was just like all of the things I wanted at once that made me feel a little bit better. It connected me to Lee and the Weavers and sort of the fact that there were these arcs in American culture like that. And it was just sort of this, it was solidarity, I
like this idea because there's a lot of days when you pick up the paper and you're seeing some pretty rough stuff that you do not think this may pass, but it's good to have these long form perspectives, see people fighting against similar stuff, and then getting that hope that this too shall pass.
Yeah, exactly.
Before we go, can you tell us just a little bit about Alternate Roots?
Oh, sure.
I love that
Thanks,
podcast.
Yeah.
Anytime a new one comes up, I'm a runner. I like to run, and I just throw it on, and it's my first thing I do. I just love
awesome. It. Yeah.
So
Alternate Roots is the podcast I do for Osiris, and the idea of it is focusing on music that's not on streaming services and not available through Spotify, which is
take some crate digging by you. I mean, you really
a little bit, but there's also, I guess for me, there's probably a little bit of a didactic message thing going on, which is that Spotify is, it's a handy utility, but I really do want to put across the point that it's really only capturing a fraction of the music that's out there, and that to make that your sole source of learning about music and your sole source of exploring music is to really cut yourself off from
limiting
music, and Alternate Roots is just sort of showing that there's live recordings, there's, bands have these independent band camps, and that, Spotify to me is the equivalent of it's the mainstream record industry at this point. It's the mainstream. It's, and the idea of independent and alternative music becomes very different when all music kind of goes through the same platform and everything looks the same and everything feels the same and everything is like, it's the album, it's got the black border, it's all the same type fonts. And I really just want to get this across that there's this, huge eclectic world out there. And, it's a pretty obvious message, but
yeah, I don't know. It's not to everybody, and I think it's a service to all these underground artists, and just how much is out there.
Yeah,
I find it mind blowing. You've put me on. I mean, when I heard the Sun Watchers Nose Beers, I was like, my God! And I love that you got the Oneida with Lee Ronaldo on there, Garcia's
and James McNew.
And James McNew. I'm sorry, I left out James from Yola Tango. Just there's so much to explore, and that's just such a cool.
Awesome.
Cool
I'm
podcast.
so glad it's connecting.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, in some ways it's an extension of I do a weekly radio show on WFMU.
Yep.
Here
When is that? I want to know.
It's late night Mondays,
okay,
midnight to 3 a.m. Technically early Tuesday mornings. Those are also all streamable, not podcast streamable.
Yeah,
streamable,
but it's out there.
Yeah.
Great.
And I guess to tie it back to the Weavers in some ways, Spotify is Spotify, but it's very corporate. You know, it's not like you don't feel a human connection when. Or I don't use Spotify, but the times I have, I definitely don't feel a human connection in the same way that I do when I pick up a physical product that's like an LP that somebody has designed, or even a CD. You know, there's like, and to me, bypassing streaming services and just sort of like looking for music directly is a way of sort of trying to find that sort of equal connection, like looking for the heads or whatever, or trying to, you know, I guess bypass this big corporate morass and sort of try to find culture that's a little bit more personal or not one-to-one, but just a little more ground level and a little, I don't know, it feels more real to me.
Real? I was going to use the word real.
Yeah.
Awesome.
But thank you for listening.
No, I'm definitely
appreciate it.
Thank you for talking to me. I love the book. I appreciate it, Jesse. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah.
Irene, good night. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams.
We learned this song, Irene, from a friend of ours. His name was Hughie Ledbetter. He called himself Leadbelly, king of the 12-string guitar. Some people thought he was the greatest folk singer that ever lived in America. We knew him best as a rememberer of folk songs, and he taught us dozens of them, especially Irene. This was his theme song, and he sang it for over 30 years before he died. Well, he died before Irene got to be known to so many millions of Americans. Hughie had a hard and wonderful life. It's over now, but his songs are still very much alive.
Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams. Last Saturday night I got married. Me and my wife settled down. Now me and my wife are partying. I'm gonna take another stroll downtown. Well, Irene, good night. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams. Sometimes I live in the country. Sometimes I live in town. Sometimes I take a great notion to jump into the river and drown. Well, Irene, good night. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams.
Stop rambling. Stop your gambling. Stop staying out late at night. Go home to your wife and family. Stay there by your fireside bright.
Well, Irene, good night. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams.
Osiris. This podcast is in the Loop, the Legion of Osiris podcasts. Osiris is creating a community that connects people like you with live experiences and podcasts about artists and topics you love. Get in the loop at osirispod.com.